and welcome to this week's weekly water cooler conversation. We are going to be talking about Loki episode 4. If you've never watched one of these, we get into lots and lots of spoilers, so you do need to have seen episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4 leading up to this absolutely incredible episode. This episode brought a lot of things together. This episode is the culmination of the first half of the show in a lot of ways. We'll talk about that post-credit scene, which, yes, there is a post-credit scene, so if you haven't seen the post-credit scene because you turned it off after and were like, oh wait, what's going on over there? Go watch that because we're going to dive all sorts of into that. And yes, it is a hat week because I may or may not have attended this bit of glory. It is in reverse because Instagram, but it says Black Widow LA premiered. It's got the date on it. You see this glory? Very, very, very stoked. We'll talk about Black Widow all over the place once people have seen it more. I gave a spoiler-free review for Black Widow on my YouTube yesterday. It was great to be back in a movie theater with people that were so invested and zealous and excited, and then I got to wait 2 hours and watch that episode of Loki. So I gotta say, I gotta thank the comic gods. I grew up loving this world and not having a lot of people to share it with. I grew up loving this world and feeling like it was my own little world, but wanting to scream it from rooftops. And I always talk about hiding my Spider-Man shirts under Abercrombie. And yesterday in one day, I got to see a fairly obscure at the time, up until recently in the 2000s, Black Widow wasn't on toy, wasn't a household name. I got to see her get her own movie. And then a few hours later, got to see Loki, the God of Mischief, on a show that is Emmy caliber, go into the Lokiverse. We live in an amazing time. If you're not completely in love with pop culture and everything that it's accomplished, and if you're one of those cynical comic book fans, this is not the show for you, because we're living in a bounty of riches. We've got a show, we've got movies, we've got a lot more coming out from Disney Plus, and we've got 4 movies this year, and the comic books are exceptional right now. Every single Wednesday there's new comic books, every single Wednesday there's new Loki, every 2 months there's new movies the rest of the year. It is a time to be a nerd. So I just want to thank the comic book gods for the gift of the present day. Let's dive into Loki episode 4. I always give them my own little title. This one I've got 2 titles for. There is Into the Lokiverse, but there's also Go For Loki. As a Four Loko fan, I do feel like hanging out with 4 Lokis would be a lot like drinking at least 1 or 2 Four Lokos, and well, I don't recommend that. Surgeon General's warning: drinking more than 1 Four Loko is a dangerous place to be, but so is hanging out with 4 Lokis. The post-credit scene, let's start with that, because that's the thing everybody's going to be talking about, and then we'll break down the episode itself. The post-credit scene is maybe 30 seconds. The post-credit scene is a reference to perhaps Battleworld, but more likely just a destroyed world where these Lokis are hiding out in a pre- or post-apocalypse. It does look more post-apocalyptic than most of the places we've seen the other Lokis hide out in. It also features 4 Lokis, one of which is Richard E. Grant. Now, we knew Richard E. Grant was in this show. A lot of people theorized all sorts of things. He might have been a TVA, he might have been this, he might have been that. I was hoping he was a Loki, but for some reason my brain couldn't comprehend that he is exactly what Jack Kirby made Loki like. For decades, Loki was an older character. It's only fairly recent that Loki is a young, charming Lothario. He's a, shapeshifter. He's the guy's mischief, so he's been many things. But if you go back to the Avengers in the 60s, if you go back to the original Loki era, a lot of the stuff the Avengers stuff is based off of, that is an old, curmudgeonly Loki, and Richard E. Grant looks just like that Loki. The costume is preposterously Silver Age. They replicated his first appearance from 1962 beautifully. So we've got 4 Lokis, one of which is classic Loki. We've also got Boastful Loki, which is a new Loki to my knowledge. I don't know that character personally. He might pop up obscurely in one frame and I just couldn't think of it. That Boastful Loki is the one wielding the hammer, which makes me wonder if he is worthy, or did he make his own hammer? Because that hammer looks very homemade. There's a very makeshift handle on it. It looks like it was constructed. So Boastful Loki, being that's his name, we'll hear all about him next week, I'm sure. We'll find out what that character is. But to my knowledge, that is not a comic book-based character. Then we've got Kid Loki in the very front, and Kid Loki is very much canon. Now, Kid Loki, I do believe, is going to be a Young Avenger. We've got a ton of Young Avengers. Every single Disney Plus show has given us a Young Avenger setup. I think this is this show's Young Avenger setup. We had the twins in WandaVision who go on to be Young Avengers. We had, Patriot in Falcon Winter Soldier who goes on to be a Young Avenger. Now we have Kid Loki, who I believe is going to go on to be a Young Avenger. And next up, we have Hawkeye, who is an incredible one. We've got America Chavez and Doctor Strange too. We've got so many Young Avengers being put together. I do think that is the next team we assemble. I think there's going to be a Young Avengers, a Dark Avengers, and potentially a world where the Avengers as we know them are not around, so other people have to rally up. And I'm wondering if the next big team we gather is the X-Men in late Phase 4, early Phase 5, but that's another whole conversation. But I do think Kid Loki, who is from the Agents of Asgard storyline, which I keep referencing, is going to be a very important fixture of the Marvel Universe going forward. I do want to also mention that I didn't share something that I saw at Disneyland because I was afraid it was a spoiler, and I know you guys know, if you watch my channel, I don't love spoilers. I don't love scoop journalism. I don't like trying to trick the studio. And toys are really tricky because you've got to manufacture them early. You got to get them out there. And a lot of times toys ruin surprises. I was at Disneyland 2 weeks ago, and there was a Kid Loki action figure set. And I took a picture of it, and I'm going to share it today now that this episode is out, because I was like, oh, that's definitely going to be on the show. I thought it was going to be episode 5. I was off by one episode. I thought it was going to be the penultimate episode where they introduced Kid Loki. But there is already an action figure of Kid Loki with Loki that is of the Marvel Legacy line. I took a photo. It's from 2 weeks ago. I'm going to share it with you guys on Twitter and Instagram today. Kid Loki is very much part of the mythos and now very much part of the show. And I also love Crocodile. I don't know what to call him. Crocodile Loki with his cute little horns. I hope he knows Throg. We talk about Throg here fairly often because Throg is fantastic. Throg is Thor as a frog, and I hope he knows Loki as a crocodile. But either way, I love that the whole shot, not only is it dystopian New York, not only is it a multiverse of Lokis, which very much establishes we are into the multiverse now. We saw the multiverse diverge on the timeline. We've teased multiverse for quite some time. We obviously have the multiverse of madness looming. Now we've got a multiverse of Lokis. We've got an assemblage of Lokis all hiding out in a post-apocalyptic place. There's a trashed Avengers Tower in the background in that shot. And again, this was a 30-second shot that gave us so much, but I really appreciate that Loki's on the ground looking up, and they are basically assembled just like the Avengers in 2012's The Avengers. So they framed the shot like the Avengers. Instead of a bow and arrow that Hawkeye's pointing at him, it's a crocodile, and it's Kid Loki. I thought that was genius. It was so fun. It was so playful. I still can't wrap my brain around the fact that we live in an era where Richard E. Grant is a Silver Age accurate Loki, but it makes me so happy. Hearing his voice and those beautiful dulcet tones, I'm so overjoyed. We got classic Loki. We got Richard E. Grant. We've got a lot of goodness to come. That's just the post-credit scene. There was so much going on very, very, very quickly. This episode is insane. All right, so I felt like the big shift moment in WandaVision happened in this episode. There's that moment in WandaVision where everything kind of coalesces and we push forward, and then the show shifts into a very different flavor. The second half of WandaVision felt much more like the MCU than the first half. I felt this transition happened in a lot smoother of a way. I love WandaVision. It's amongst my favorite Marvel properties. It's in my top half of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I do feel like they handled it a lot smoother in this, and this show also feels more in its own universe. There's production design in this show. Everything about this show is so cohesive that you really feel immersed in a very different way. So that transition in this episode felt smoother, and I really love the world they've established because of that smoothness. It did feel like we had time to breathe in this world, so when things start changing, it doesn't feel as jarring. I love all the payoffs that they set up in the first 3 episodes being paid off in this one episode while setting up the 5th and 6th episode of the show. This show does a great job of closing a window and 2 doors open, because the doors are bigger. The metaphor, I changed it a little bit. You close a window, 2 doors open, because holy crap, there's so many places we can go. But they did a lot of window closing to keep going with the metaphor in this episode. We got the Mobius-Loki friendship payoff, which they've set up from the very beginning. We got the Sylvie and Loki hangout episode 3 payoff. A few people I heard complaints about how episode 3 was just hanging out with Sylvie and Loki, and I was like, 1, that's awesome. 2, that was a full-on action spectacle. What are you talking about? 3, I want to hang out with these characters all the time. My favorite stuff is hearing them wax poetic and philosophical and existential, and I've been loving the pace of this show, but a lot of people thought that 3 felt like a filler episode of them, which I disagree. That was definitely paid off in this episode because that was the reason that this episode was possible, the way they were rescued, which I also enjoyed, by the way, that Loki wasn't tricking. Neither of them were tricking the other. They're both actually trapped there, and love saved them. But that episode had that payoff. The timekeepers were paid off in this episode. We've all been wondering how fake they were, and we found out in this episode just how fake they were. That was a big payoff. We had the B-15 payoff with the character that we met in the very beginning, who's been a bit of a nemesis, but has actually been, trying to figure her own stuff out, which has been... Man, she was incredible in this episode. B-15 stole the show in a lot of ways this episode. C-20 payoff. We got to find out what happened to Sasha Lane in this episode. We also have the Renslayer as the bad guy payoff, which has been teased. There's been nefariousness about her, so that arc came to, ahead in this episode as well. We had the Lady Sif going AWOL payoff from 2012. The last time we saw Lady Sif in a movie was Thor: The Dark World. Last time we saw Lady Sif in the universe was 2015 in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. We haven't seen Lady Sif in 6 years, and they talked about her briefly in Ragnarok, and there's finally this wasn't as much of a payoff, except for me personally loving Jamie Alexander's Lady Sif. We got another big moment that ties a lot of things together and makes it feel like a fully grown world. All of that in one episode. How many doors were opened because of it? Now we have more Renslayer questions. Now we have more questions about the Timekeepers. Now we have all those things. So I love that it kind of, all the questions you asked in the first 3 episodes did kind of get answered in their own way, but they just have you ask more questions. And I love when a show is able to do that so smoothly. We also had a very important line that opened a lot of doors to the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, and that is Owen Wilson saying, Kree, Titans, and vampires. He's talking about how much trouble these demigods are while mentioning the things they deal with normally. Kree are a warrior race. I've talked about them a bunch on this weekly water cooler conversation because they keep referencing Hala, they keep referencing Kree places. Kree are very important to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, to the Marvel comic book universe, and we've only met one, basically. We've seen others, but we've only really met one, and that's Ronan the Accuser. And the Kree are a fixture of what the Skrulls come to be. I do think they're going to be important in Captain Marvel 2. Oh, I forgot Miss Marvel earlier. Miss Marvel, another Young Avenger. She has her own show. I just haven't seen it yet, so it slipped my mind. We haven't met her yet. Miss Marvel as well, but the Kree, I think, are going to be a part of the Marvel universe in the sense of Captain Marvel, as well as Miss Marvel, but the Marvel universe in the sense of the Marvel universe. I do think the Kree are going to be a big part there, and then obviously they're going to be huge in Secret Invasion. So, Kree, it's good to hear that name. It's good to hear them mentioned. It's only going to get more important. Titans are basically going to be essential to the storyline of the Eternals. The Titan we've met so far is Thanos. Thanos is the Mad Titan. Titans are very important, powerful figures in the Marvel comic universe. We're going to have them basically come to a head in the Eternals. I do believe that Thanos is going to show up. Technically, Thanos is Angelina Jolie's cousin in the Eternals. So I do think that we're going to meet some Titans. I do think the Titans are important, so that was an important line. And, of course, vampires was the moment that every fan of Blade has been wanting to hear since we found out the Blade universe was getting reimagined. Mahershala Ali is playing Blade. It's been very quiet since Comic-Con, but now we got some movement with the mention of vampires. Vampires are canon, and it's a very, very exciting time to be a comic book fan. Vampires are in the Marvel Cinematic Universe by mention by the great Owen Wilson, and they're coming very, very soon. Yes, there was a joke of vampires mentioned in Thor by the great Taika Waititi, but it felt like a joke. This felt like real. Vampires are here. All right, let's break down a bit of the episode, some highlights. It somehow took me until viewing number 2 to put together that young Lady Loki was the child in the beginning. I was so tired because I had just come from premiere that my brain did not connect to this kid. I was like, oh, they're showing that Renslayer is a Minuteman and she was a field agent. And my brain, the second episode was like, there's so much to do with Lady Loki. Like, she later references, do you remember me? It slipped me completely by. This is why I watch it twice. I do not do well at midnight. I'm an old man now. I needed to watch it this morning, and then my brain got to be awake and go, oh, of course. I really love the young Lady Loki stuff as a child. It adds to the mystery. What is her Nexus event? She didn't do anything wrong. She just existed. Is her existence, like she implied in episode 3, the thing that caused the sacred timeline? Does the sacred timeline actually exist, or is there just one timeline the timekeepers want to keep control of? Lots of questions still about that, but Lady Loki as a child scene, that was so ripe with little details. I guess they're Easter eggs, but they're details in the storytelling. The Valkyrie were still alive in her timeline. The Valkyrie were destroyed by Hela in our MCU timeline, but she's playing with little Valkyrie toys. She's also fighting dragons with those little Valkyrie toys. There's also a Fenris toy. Fenris is the giant wolf we met in Thor Ragnarok that Hulk fights. There's so much fun Asgardian lore in that one brief little scene in that Asgard, but it's her Asgard. It's a different Asgard because she's from that universe. They built so much world in the opening 2 minutes of this show. Judge Renslayer, obviously, was a field agent and a Minuteman, but Minute person, but they called him Minuteman. Beautiful detail about that is all of them had designations, right? We've got B-15, who's one of the leads of the show. We've got C-20, who's Sasha Lane. They've all got, letter, number. She is A-23. And yes, that is a comic book reference because the glorious, glorious minds at Marvel think ahead. A-23, I believe, stands for Avengers 23, which is her first appearance. The first appearance of the character of Renslayer is way back in Avengers 23. She is A23. Beautiful work. Beautiful work. The universe wants to break free, so it manifests chaos. I love that line. Lady Loki talking about it manifesting chaos and it basically trying to be free makes me think that there are meant to be many timelines. They're meant to be branching timelines, that we are stuck in one little facet of it because of the TVA being fascist, because of the way they're strong-arming everything. I do believe that there's a lot more to be said about that thought, but I love the dialogue there, and I love how eloquently it was put. The universe is trying to break free, so it manifests chaos. I'm fascinated by that concept. I also feel like that's true of our world. Lady Loki does, in fact, seem to be Lady Loki. I have not accepted that up until this point. Up until last week, I was still saying, is she Enchantress? Is she Lady Loki? Are we all being tricked? Is she a creation of another Loki? I didn't know what to trust. It does seem she is, in fact, Lady Loki. We saw a flashback. She seems to be a character named Sylvie that is Lady Loki, but it does seem to be somewhat more tangible now. Plus, they're lying to each other less. They're being less mischievous at each other. I'm starting to actually believe what they're having to say at one another. The planet exploding is stunningly beautiful. I just want to give some love to the production design and to the special effects artists that made that exploding planet so ethereal and beautiful and oddly romantic. It was a really stunning scene. It's a follow-through from last week, but it was just beautiful to watch it in its stunning destruction. And that's where I grew up at the end of 1,000 Worlds. We've known our Loki for some time. We know Tom Hiddleston's Loki. We know how broken he is. We know what he survived. We know the betrayals. We know how many people he's lost. But in, 3 hours? Less, 2 hours? We've gotten to know new Loki. We've gotten to know Lady Loki. And in that one line, you really kind of catch up on a lot of trauma. She's lived at the death of 1,000 Worlds. She's never gotten to know anyone. She's more alone, arguably, than even Tom Hiddleston. Tom Hiddleston talks about being alone so very much, and that's kind of the thing with Lady Sif that we'll get to in a minute, but she's never had anyone because she's always been in dying world. That's how she survived, by hiding, and that was just a really tragic, beautiful line. I really love that he wasn't tricking her. Their love weirdly works for me, both in chemistry of actors, chemistry of characters, and in narcissism of characters. I bought their love. I think they're really beautiful together. I don't know what that says about me. I don't know what that says about narcissism, because they're both very narcissistic characters. They both crave attention. They've both been alone for so long. They've both been lacking in love. They've both felt put out by their family. They both felt like they were, cursed with glorious purpose, but also cursed with being gods of mischief. There's a lot about them falling for each other that really makes sense. And their self-love, both healthily and unhealthily, would mirror love for the other. So it's interesting. And is it masturbation? That's the question. It's a fascinating concept. And then they talked about that breaking reality, like Owen Wilson's character talks about how it's breaking his reality in the moment. And I don't know if that would break reality. If two variants find love, what does that even do to a timeline? What does it even do to anything? It's an interesting quandary. And what is self-love in this situation? It's a fascinating everything. I love it so very much, and it's so very weird. There's nothing quite like a Mobius Loki dialogue scene. Such barbed wit. We missed Mobius last week. It was a beautiful episode. It was an action-packed episode. But man, oh man, I love me some Mobius. It was so good to have the two of them back. It's a few minutes of scene, but them going back and forth, both outwitting each other, both attacking each other's intelligence, both attacking each other about who they are. Neither of them trusting the other, but wanting to. There is an actual friendship that's kind of shaping a future relationship, maybe not anymore, but there's a friendship being born, and there's a trust that's attempted to be made with two characters that inherently don't trust each other. And I love that all of that comes across in a couple lines of dialogue, because these actors are so incredible and the writing is so top notch. All of that barbed wit. Once again, the line, it's breaking my reality right now. I also want to mention the now that came out is the closest we're going to get to a wow. And the now was, but yeah, the it's breaking my reality right now. I'm very curious about the experience of all of these variables, all of these varieties. Has this ever happened before? There's obviously a lot of Lokis. Have other Lokis fallen in love? Have other variants fallen in love with each other? Have other clones of TVA agents run into each other? Will there be a whole planet of Mobiuses? Have Mobiuses met other Mobiuses? Is the other accountant a spare Mobius? Is the TVA a series of different floors where other variants might be that don't even meet other versions of themselves? Are there versions of themselves they've met and they're just played off as twins? There's so many questions about what it could mean to be a variant and how knowing one of your other variants would be a problem, and that whole reality concept being that Mobius is in fact a variant. A lot of questions raised, and that scene is, every scene of dialogue between the two of them is my favorite. That's how I feel. The folksy dopey insult from the folksy dope is such a fun line. Hard to say, but it's so much fun. I'm really just about the language of this episode. I kept loving the dialogue. I kept wanting to live in the dialogue, and I think that's the strength of this show. The budget is the world they've built. A lot of the show is people talking, and the talking is so beautifully versed and poetic and introspective and existential and ponderous. I love the language of the show, and I love the questions it raises, and I really hope it digests in people. I hope that you, dear viewer, are receiving all of these questions and looking at yourself. What is your self-love? What is your purpose? Where do you come from? What do you feel like you're meant to do? What do you feel like you've been slighted by? Do you go back and look at your own flaws and kick yourself in the balls with a manifestation of your sister that you messed up in the past? Can you find a way to forgive yourself and evolve? All of these questions the show is asking is so important that we ask ourselves all these existential quandaries of like what it means to be alive, what it means to have purpose, what it means to be a player in this game of life, whether or not you're a lead or a supporting player, whether or not you're bolstering people up, whether or not you're cursed with glorious purpose. You got to look at your shit. I love that the show is, at least for me, having me do that. I love that we never know which of them knows who is lying to whom. What if Loki was manipulating Sylvie? I don't believe he was. I don't think we've seen anything to allude to that. But he's such a good actor, and Loki's such a mischievous scamp that for a second you're like, wait, and your brain opens up to the possibility. Like, what if he had met her before? Like, I don't think that's the case. I'm saying it's really incredible that they're both so quick on their feet, that they're giving each other just the right amount of dialogue and just the right amount of information that it makes you think it is possible, and that's really good writing. Lady Sif returns. Okay, so we're at the point of the show where Lady Sif is back. I'm a huge Jamie Alexander fan. I'm a huge fan of Lady Sif. If you watch, I did an episode of Rotten Tomatoes is Wrong about Thor the Dark World. A lot of it is me as a love letter to Lady Sif. I'm a big fan of that character, a big fan of her in Thor the Dark World. Go watch it over on Rotten Tomatoes. I love the way that character is utilized. She has been Thor's wife in the comic books, and what's interesting is in Greek mythology and in the comic books, there's an entire sequence that actually is this sequence. Loki does cut her hair in her sleep to spite Thor. This actually happened in Greek myth, and it actually happens in the comic book universe, and now it's happened in the MCU. So this is now in all different versions of myth. I love when art can replicate art and be used in different moral quandaries. So this was a Greek myth written thousands of years ago. Then it was in the comics in the 70s. So that was 50 years ago. And now it's in a TV format. And it's the same concept being used to show the growth of Loki, being used to show the growth of the character, being used to show the growth of who he is. I love that we're using the same story and the same allegory to grow this character in different mediums through vastly different times and through vastly different eras of humanity. it's still the same foundation. I always talk about comic books being our modern day Greek myth, which is why I kept saying Greek myth. Our modern day looking at Zeus and the gods and what we believe. The best thing religion does is give us a moral compass. I think comic books are a great moral compass for people. I think they're great allegories and metaphors for being better. It's one of the reasons I love comics so much. I think they make you a better person. I love that we now, through the TV medium, are getting some of these myths and we're repurposing them for this new world we live in. You conniving, craven, pathetic worm, you did this. I hope you know you deserve to be alone, and you always will be. Every time that line comes out, it hurts a little bit more. Every time that line comes out, that's the whole thing Loki's afraid of. Loki doesn't want to be alone. Loki's afraid of being alone. Loki fears that exact thing, and then we see the dichotomy between that moment in his past and how Mobius treats him in this episode a little later on. And all Loki ever wanted was to feel welcome. He always wanted the attention, but he also wanted that attention because he wasn't given it. So this scene was really painful because of how much we've seen Loki grow. I think there should be more little time pits for people to look at their own shit. I think this was a really beautiful scene, really well done, and that is a good way to interrogate prisoners. It's a good way to use time to manipulate a prisoner. I think it was genius all around, and it brought back Jamie Alexander, which made me very happy. I just talked about this moment alludes to a prank played by Loki in the comics and to the Norse mythology that inspired them. Loki cuts off Sif's golden locks as a prank, and a furious Thor demands his brother fix them. Loki convinces dwarven craftsmen to create new hair for Sif, and they create several other magical items for the gods, including Mjolnir. So it's an OOG myth predating even Mjolnir. It helped inspire, at least in this one Norse canon, there's obviously different variations of Norse myth, at least in this one, it did inspire Mjolnir being created in the first place, which is very freaking cool. Mobius and Renslayer celebration and office scene. If you could go anywhere, anytime on the timeline, that whole speech, I believe, was Renslayer trying to save Mobius. I think she knew that Mobius had to go. I'm pretty sure the setup was for the variants and Mobius going in to see the timekeepers to wipe them all. She said to watch the pruning, but I think they were going to take them all out. He knows too much. There's too many variables. I think her asking was her trying to save him. I think she does actually care about him. I think she's a master manipulator. I think she might be the big bad because of the comics. I also think that she does care about Mobius, and I also think there might be more than one Mobius. I do think at the end of our precious Mobius, he realized it as well, that she was trying to save him. It comes up enough times. I do think that line was pointing us in that direction. Anywhere in any timeline, obviously he would want to go to the mid-90s on a jet ski, and there was so much jet ski love in this episode. I need to see him in a suit, in that green suit, on a jet ski. I need it in my life. I think they were going to prune all three of them at once when we got to the timekeepers. We're almost to that scene in our timeline. She does seem to generally care about him. I'm stoked for the B-15 Sylvie team up. Sylvie was a force in this episode. The actress that plays Sylvie has done such great work this whole time. She embodied Lady Loki at one point. She's been the no-nonsense agent. She's also been the agent that starts to see things wrong. She's also had the emotions of seeing her own timeline come back. She's had to do a lot of incredible work, and she has very consistently. So a lot of love for B-15. I love the team up with Sylvie. I love their dynamic. I love how they've really worked that into... There's a lot of trust between certain characters that is just the relief of knowing you're not crazy, which is also a part of our reality. But I really love Sylvie coming to help and being a force of good. I, from the beginning, thought Sylvie was going to be the good guy and the TVA was going to be the bad guy. I think this episode is the most we've seen that. Sylvie doesn't need to help B-15 and willingly does. The TVA is the villain, and it's been interesting to watch all that unfold, and B-15 is the reason we're able to see that with such a beautiful eyeline. I love the old school new tech of the show. Mobius basically watches that footage from a pre-Game Boy Color Game Boy, the OG 16-bit Game Boy is what he's watching that footage on. That style of this neo-modern 50s thing that we're living through. I'm loving the production design in the show. I'm loving the detail work. I have to trust the word of two Lokis. How about the word of a friend? Again, the dialogue. Owen Wilson flabbergasted by actually being in the wrong his whole life and seeing it through Loki's eyes and seeing that two Lokis were correct and having to go against all of his wiring. He never got Lady Loki zapped and saw his own memories. He's the only one we've seen come to through his own realizations and trusting in Loki. Loki telling him something is the only reason he believes the TVA is this way. He might have had his suspicions, but he's the only one that ever got the zap and saw his own life. He just is going off the Loki's word. So trusting two Lokis, how about the word of a friend, is a beautiful, beautiful bit of dialogue summing up their relationship. I love their bromance, and also it is a very It is a very good trope, and I can't believe I fell for it. You give the beautiful saccharine sweet moment, you solve the problem that's been building, you do all of this right before killing a character. That is a comic book trope, that is a TV show trope, that is a movie trope, that is all of those things. And yet, there's this beautiful saccharine sweet bromance moment, and I did not even mentally acknowledge we might lose Mobius in the next scene. Like, that was so well set up. It was so well done. We have this beautiful moment between the two of them, and then he literally tells Loki, so you can be whoever you want to be, even someone good, in case anyone ever told you different. Loki hears what he's always wanted to hear. Loki is friends with Mobius. They're brothers now. This is a moment, and then then he watches the person that cares about him die. Loki watches another person that cares about him die. So Loki has that beautiful smile, acceptance of goodness, and yes, I want to be good. Yes, I've chosen to be good. I know people have told you your whole life you're the god of mischief, but no, you don't have to be. He gets that moment, and then, boom, we lose Mobius, and then we see Mobius get pruned, and then we see Loki reacting to that, and there's like 3 cuts back and forth, but the gasp and the pain and everything else is just absolutely beautiful. I love very much the way they handle trauma on the Disney Plus shows. All 3 of the shows have been about trauma. WandaVision was about the trauma of loss and not accepting it and fighting through grief, through delusion. Falcon Winter Soldier is about the trauma of reality and racism and living in utilitarian, a bit of a fascist state while thinking you're not. That show's about, very modern trauma. And this show is about not ever being welcome. This show's about feeling like an outsider. This show's about what it means to be alive and not to be the lead of your own story in a lot of ways. This show's about a lot of other dark and traumatic things. So the way they handle trauma in these beautiful bits of acting and the ability of Tom Hiddleston to do this rapid emotional shift work while still making it believable. Like, it's hard when I have a weird tendency to laugh and stop laughing right away, and it's very unnerving because when I'm interviewing someone, I try to make sure the beat lands and then you move on to the next subject. So for the editor, I try to make sure there's clean cuts, but sometimes you look like an absolute crazy person when you're like, ha! And it's a very unnerving thing, and Loki manipulates that unnerving nature, but when it's emotionally tinged, like, he does the big smile and drops it a lot to make you uncomfortable. But when there's an emotional beat where you're feeling for his emotionality and he transitions into stoic or resolute or any of those things, you don't feel like it's a ploy. You feel like it's Loki just collectively handling all of his emotions. You feel like it's Loki having gone through so much loss and having been so broken already. It's just how he maneuvers through trauma. There's a beautiful 1-2 punch in that scene where he goes from, he just lost Mobius and it crushes him, and then he has to be resolute and be strong and handle his business because that's what he does. And it's brilliant acting, and it's silent. It's just work. It's just Tom Hiddleston doing the work with his face. It's incredible. The acting in the show is like nothing else, man. Like, and Owen Wilson and him back and forth. Everyone, good goddamn, the acting in the show. I can't even. What was Sylvie's Nexus event? Will that be a thing? Will we find out in the next episode of the 6th episode? I don't think it was her existing, because she was like 7. The TVA would have found her earlier. She was old enough to have lived as a variant for some time. What was her event? So Sylvie told us in a bit of a disparaging way her existence was a negative, and that is kind of a Loki mindset, right? Like, it's about the trauma of being a Loki. Her existence was the problem, but we know it's not because she was older when she got captured. So what was her Nexus event? She was playing with toys. I'm very curious what the actual thing was and what it means for other people's Nexus's events, what it means for other variants existing. So the detail of the golden elevator we saw a few episodes ago, she kept saying, C20 kept saying, the golden elevator, the golden, and we got in the golden elevator, and we did go to the Timekeepers this week, and they set all of that golden elevator stuff up quite some time ago. So the Timekeepers, we finally meet them. The Timekeepers we've all thought might be fake. We finally land that plot line in this episode. The Timekeepers are in fact androids. This does quite a few things. One, it sets up who's controlling these androids, who's working them, who built them, were they ever real? And then they were replaced with androids as a fixture. Did Renslayer know they were androids? And, perhaps most importantly of all, androids, aliens, and wizards. There's a line in Falcon Winter Soldier where he says the big 3, androids, aliens, and wizards.
I have a feeling they might be a part of the big 3.
What big 3?
The big 3.
What big 3?
Androids, aliens, and wizards.
That's not a thing.
That's definitely a thing.
No, it's not.
Every time we fight one of the three.
So who are you fighting now, Gandalf?
How do you know about Gandalf?
I read The Hobbit in 1937 when it first came.
Now we've got our androids. I'm very curious. Also, if you think about in canon, there's a scene where we have characters walk through this portal and the androids would explode if they were machines and didn't know they're machines. The show opens with Loki asking himself if he's real. And that's a fun existential quandary, but it's also because he's walking through a machine that checks for machines. Does that have anything to do with the timekeepers being machines? Does that have anything to do with what that world is for machines? The timekeepers clearly, or whoever made the timekeepers clearly knows they need to watch out for shit like that. So I have a big question about that machine, which we saw again in this episode, that detects machines because the timekeepers were in fact machines. I'm curious if the timekeepers were ever real. They do have a Kang-ness about them, the coloring, the wardrobe, but they also look just like the timekeepers from the comics, who kind of also look like a little bit like Kang. The in-show timekeepers look like a mix between Kang and the comic book timekeepers. So is that an Easter egg reference to Kang to come? Did Kang make them? Did Kang manipulate and control them? Kang and Renslayer are a couple in the comic books. Renslayer is a force of nature in the comic books. Renslayer actually is able to infiltrate a bunch of variant Kangs, destroy a bunch of Kangs, and almost tear the Avengers apart from the inside out singularly by herself. Renslayer is an absolute force, and we got to see that somewhat in this episode. We got to see her fighting, we got to see how much she's been manipulating. I think she might be the big bad, but because the comic canon would allow for that. But I'm also curious if Kang is going to end up being the one manipulating her, because there's a few emotional beats where she feels earnest in her love for Mobius. She feels earnest in the moment where she's about to get taken out. She almost looks like it's welcome. So now I'm wondering if she is a variant that is also been manipulated, if her mind has been warped, something to that effect, if Kang has been controlling her in some way, if Kang has manipulated her directly, or if she's going to be the manipulator herself. Is Renslayer the big bad? Is Kang the big bad? Did Renslayer know about the TVA agents being androids or LMDs or whatever they ended up being? They could, I mean, it'd be weird to have them be life model decoys of, well, LMDs have been mentioned in the MCU, but are they life model decoys of the original Timekeepers? A lot of questions whether or not the Timekeepers ever existed. They were very much Disneyland animatronics. I wish, to be honest, I know TV budgets are insane. Look at episode 3. The show is the biggest budget of any show that I know of. They're doing a lot with what they have. But I had wished that the actual Timekeepers were animatronic, because there was a bit of CGI-ness that I hadn't seen. The show's done an incredible job of hiding CGI. There's a lot of CG in the show, in the depth of field, in some of the world building and all that stuff. And they've done a really great job of blending it. And I do feel like the Timekeepers were the first time I was like, oh, I am aware of budget. So I would have loved if they were animatronic, since the characters were animatronic. It would have been cool to see a bit more of the Disneyland animatronic flavor. Is Mephisto controlling them? No. When we lost Papa Loki himself, we lost Loki moments after this. Loki got pruned, y'all. We lost 2 of our 3 leads in this episode. We lost our first 2 episodes leads, Loki and Mobius. They gone. We lost them, and now we just have Sylvie until the post-credit scene. But I love that not only do we lose Loki through a backstabbing, but they framed it exactly like Coulson. So we've talked about backstabbing this whole episode, this whole series. Backstabbing's been a recurring theme, both literally and metaphorically. The comeuppance for your sins and paying your dues and being a better person is a very big plot point of the show. Coulson is why the Avengers exists. They needed something to avenge. Clark Gregg magnificently charmed everyone for 5 movies. Then when he died, it caused the Avengers. He was in our row last night at Black Widow, and the dude is just so fascinatingly charming, and just like you want to form a team to avenge him. Like Clark Gregg the Man, you're like, I get it. I would rally for Coulson. The mirroring of Coulson's death with Loki, I think, is a really beautiful way to really sum up the show. It's Loki paying for his past misdeeds, it's Loki growing from them, it's Loki evolving because of them, and that shot was beautiful. It was a 2012 Avengers shot. He got stabbed through the back, much like he stabbed Coulson, and it really sums up a lot of the metaphors of the show, and I thought it was really beautifully done, and I was also not expecting it. It was, again, they got me where I was so invested in the touching moment, and he's saying all the nice things, and he's about to confess his love and confess the growth he has as a person, murked. gets taken right out immediately. What does Sylvie know that Renslayer needs to know? The last line of dialogue in the episode is Renslayer saying, I need you to tell me everything. That is fascinating. What does Sylvie know that Renslayer doesn't know? Renslayer does seem to be in control at the end of the episode. She did just kill Loki. What does Sylvie possibly know that Renslayer doesn't? What master awareness does Sylvie have? Because she's been hiding in timelines. She also set all of this plan in motion. She's the one that started setting off those detonating bombs that messed up the timeline. There's so much that Sylvie could know. What is it specifically that Renslayer wants to know that also leads me to believe that Renslayer's been the one controlling the Timekeepers this whole time? I have to admit, as the credits rolled, I had no idea how the show could carry on, what they were going to do with Loki and Mobius. Was it going to be called Sylvie next week? I thought it'd be kind of funny if we open the episode and it basically just says Sylvie with the different letters. I thought it'd be really funny if the different Sylvie letters and they called the show Sylvie for a week. Either way, I was like, we lost two of our leads. And then the credits rolled and I was like, we haven't had a post-credit scene yet, but just like other shows, as things really start to escalate, they gave us a post-credit scene. The post-credit scene we talked about at the top of the episode. Do variants end up someplace? Can they? Do we get a bunch of cloned Mobiuses like in the comics? In the comic books, Mobius is cloned a bunch of times. Every character in the TVA is a clone of Mobius, and in real life, that is a clone of Steven Grunwald, who we've talked about a bunch in the show, who is editor-in-chief for some time and the continuity expert over at Marvel. A titan of Marvel Comics is what they modeled the character of Mobius after, and having him be replicated a bunch of times, and also what they made Owen Wilson's look like. So they made Owen Wilson look like the character they based the comic book character off of. That's an actual comic book editor. It's a lot. It's beautiful. I'm very happy they did it. So, will we get a ton of Mobiuses? Will we get a cloned Mobius world? Is there something to the pruning that causes you to go to a planet? Do you die or do you just go to a collective? I have so many questions, especially since we know the variants of the TVA are manipulated into coming back. Is there a place that processes these variants? Is it a teleportation versus a killing? I hope there's a world of Mobiuses. Also, more likely, it's Loki variants that are hiding out on a planet that have gotten escaped. I assume the pruning is the end of you, and then these were Lokis that escaped and are hiding out on this post-apocalyptic planet. In this episode, we saw 2077 and 2050. We saw the Roxcart world again, and we saw the timeline we've been living on. I don't know if these dates are ever going to matter, but I've been keeping track of them every episode. Classic Loki is the Journey into Mystery 1962 outfit. All of that set in New York City, which is where Loki obviously did a lot of his mischief. Classic Loki is much more common in the comic book, decades of Loki comic mythology. Is there a non-sacred timeline? Is there another timeline that the TVA didn't know about? Is there any such thing as the sacred timeline except for from the TVA's perspective? Kaylee Fleming, who plays young Sylvie, the girl in the opening, young Lady Loki, is the same actress that played young Rey in Star Wars, so I love that little Disney synergy. That, I believe, is all of the details I noticed, and I think we are out of time because I don't want this to cut me off. So much love. I will see you guys next Wednesday. Tune into KoiCast this week. Dropped already. Tune into all my shows all week long. Tuesday, new Koi Cube. Wednesdays, new this. The Late Con with Coy Jandreau is the edited version of this. Check it out. Subscribe. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I will see you all next week. I love doing this show. Please share this with your friends. Like it, share it, comment. Build the algorithm. I want to do this more. Send it to people. I appreciate you guys. I'll see you next week. Bye.